This is Jan Banker, your chaplain, and you're joining me for what I'm calling a mini Bible study. I picked for us today to study together Genesis 22. It's the story of Abraham and Isaac. And if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab it and open it up to Genesis 22. I want to give you a warning label. Scholars I consulted often said, what do we do with this text? It's horrifying that Abraham would plan to kill his son as an act of faith and that God would command it. Genesis 22, verses 1 through 14. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And Abraham said, Here I am. God said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, Father, and he said, Here I am, my son. He said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Well, the first sentence strikes a very ominous note, like it's a Hitchcock film. That God would do this as a test is a picture of a God that makes most of us very uncomfortable. And that Abraham would see this as reasonable and not challenge it is baffling. My frustration with it as a story is the same frustration I feel with the Disney movies based on fairy tales and other imaginative stories. Think Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid. The mother is either missing or for some reason dead, leaving the children in a very precarious situation with their father, which of course is what sets the plot in motion. Where is Sarah in this story? I have no answer other than it would definitely derail the plot. I think that if Sarah had overheard this opening conversation, she would have grabbed her only son Isaac, stood her ground with Abraham, and sent him back to his mother. But I digress. There's a Yiddish folk tale that goes something like this. Why did God not send an angel to tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? Because God knew that no angel would take on such a task. Instead, the angel said, if you want to command death, do it yourself. God demands a horrible thing. The rabbis imagine this scene. God said, Take your son. And Abraham said, I have 2 sons. God answered him, Your only son. Abraham said, Each is the only son of his mother. God said, The one whom you love. Abraham replied, Is there any limit to a father's love? God answered, Isaac. Later, Isaac says, see, we have fire and wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham, heart torn in two, says, God will see to the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And again, the two of them walked on together. Whether Isaac knew what was going to happen is a matter that the rabbis debated. The near sacrifice of Isaac, or the Akedah as it is called in the Jewish tradition, is a narrative filled with suspense. The Hebrew prose of this story is beautiful, succinct, and surprisingly unambiguous. Take your son, your only son whom you love, that is Isaac, and go, Lech Lecha, to the land of Moriah, and offer him up there as a burnt offering. Which is more disconcerting, that God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, or that Abraham seemingly complies without protest? Compounding the ethical problem is the practical one. Isaac is the long-awaited child of the promise. And at this point, he is the only one left in Abraham's household through whom God's covenant promises could be realized. The final hope that Abraham and Sarah have for a great name is about to be snuffed out at God's command. This story does not subscribe to later notions of God's perfect omniscience. This is a genuine test, and Abraham is free to decide what he will do. God neither knows nor preordains how Abraham will respond. Abraham and his descendants are the means by which God has chosen to bless the whole world. How will Abraham produce a son when Sarah is barren? This primary theme is complicated by this sub-theme, the wavering faith of Abraham, his own conflicted and divided loyalties. Abraham is not always proven up to the task. The wife-sister charade, Hagar and Ishmael, laughing when told Sarah will bear a child. Now God needs to know whether Abraham is willing to give up the thing most precious to him in all the world for the sake of being faithful to God who gave him the gift in the first place. Genesis 22 verse 1 describes it as a test. Some scholars say that clearly signals to the reader that God had no intentions of going through with it. What do you think? It's horrible to realize this, but child sacrifice was actually common in Abraham's cultural milieu. Human sacrifice was a fact of life among the peoples of the ancient Near East, in tension with whom Israel first achieved cultural self-definition. We need to remind ourselves that our horrified shock at thinking about ritually killing a child was no shock at all in Abraham's world, according to the scholars that I consulted. No biblical story better depicts how the Bible is at cross purposes with itself on the subject of sacrifice than does the story of Abraham and Isaac. Child sacrifice was apparently practiced at some of the Israelite history. You can look at Judges 11, Jeremiah 19, Micah 6. In another tradition, firstborn humans are to be redeemed simply by the payment of 5 shekels of silver. That's in Numbers 18. We know that sacrifice of the firstborn happened all over the world. The Carthaginians, the Phoenicians, all these ancient people practiced child sacrifice, and it's partly evidenced recently by mass graves of children and animals. Cultural anthropologist and theologian René Girard explains, my interpretation of Isaac's sacrifice is that it is the end of child sacrifice. When Isaac asks his father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham's answer, Girard said, is extraordinary and one of the most significant points in the whole of the Bible. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. Israel's renunciation of the practice of human sacrifice took place over a long period of time, during which intermittent reversions to it occurred, before announcing the end of sacrifice with Christ. The Bible shows this gradual movement away from it in the story of Isaac. God asked Abraham to kill his son. Which God is that? Girard points out that it's the old God. It's the traditional God or regional God. The command comes from God. In Hebrew, it's El, E-L. And that's the old religion. But the text is very powerful and deep. What the text tells you ultimately, says Girard, is that in order to transcend the old gods, you must obey them. If you do away with human sacrifice, you must have that stage of animal sacrifice. And you're going to get beyond child sacrifice, not by rebelling against religion, but by staying within your tradition, which will come to include the transcendence of child sacrifice. Girard thinks that is what the text ultimately says. God will provide. The prophets operate in a world where violence is getting worse and worse, and people think they're going to be saved by sacrifices. But the prophets all say sacrifices are of no use at all anymore. What are your endless sacrifices to me, God says through the prophet Isaiah. Let me have no more of the din of your chanting, God says through Amos, but let justice flow like water and integrity like an unfailing stream. The institution of sacrifice is dead, and the only way to replace sacrifice, Girard says, is to be good to your neighbor. That's a message I think that's really important for our day. Why is that story in the collection of sacred scripture? Girard points out that the Bible shows us the history of the relationship between God and humanity and the progressive revelation of more and more truth. So at the beginning, not only was there was sacrifice of the firstborn child. The Bible is the text that tells us about the disappearance of child sacrifice. Why does it say that? That's the greatness of the text. Girard says it doesn't hide anything. It tells us that Abraham obeys God. Abraham obeys the old common ways. He's a traditionalist. He follows the rules. It's tradition that changes here, Girard says. The command to Abraham to sacrifice his child is not in order to a single special man. It's about a cultural change. Abraham is the symbol of that enormous change from the sacrifice of humans and even children to the sacrifice of animals. It's a sign of tremendous progress in civilization. What's extraordinary about this biblical text for Girard is that it first shows us an Abraham who is still obedient to the system of human sacrifice. It shows the obedience first. It's out of that obedience that true change becomes possible. Pastor and popular author Brian McLaren writes, "It's never too late to have our experience of God transformed." It was commonplace, he says, in the ancient world for a man to lead his son up a mountain to be sacrificed to his deity. It was extraordinary for a man to come down the mountain with his son still alive. Through that ancient story, Abraham's descendants explained why they had changed their theory or model of God and why they dared to be different from their neighbors who still practiced human sacrifice. It wasn't too late, McLaren said, to challenge widely held assumptions and change their theology. The story named by Christians the sacrifice of Isaac and by Jews the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, has engendered heated debate over the centuries. For Christians, the sacrifice of the beloved Son has obvious resonance with Jesus' death. The lectionary puts it in the summer reading and in the Easter Vigil, always as a secondary reading, essentially giving pastors a more palatable first choice text to use instead. Genesis 22 has continued to be understood by many as a story of faith against all odds and as a foreshadowing of God's self-giving in the passion of Christ, son carrying the wood. Abraham saying, God will provide, take your son, your only son, your beloved son. That interpretation gets tested historically, scholars point out, as it is not written as a prediction in the text of Genesis 22. And yet, theologically, God does provide here. and provides again in the Gospels, and particularly in John's Gospel, where Jesus is called the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It's echoed in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and echoed in the baptism annunciations to Jesus in the Gospels. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved." What we see in the New Testament is that it is not humans who offer a sacrifice to God, but God who offers a sacrifice to humans. The whole self-giving of Jesus becomes possible because Jesus is obedient to God, giving himself in the midst of humanity's revengeful rage and violence. In 1 John 1, verse 5, we see the nucleus of the gospel. This is the message which we have heard from Jesus and proclaim to you, that God is light and in God is no darkness at all. Divine truth is constituted by love and non-violence. In the case of Isaac, it is the voice of the true God that prevents his sacrifice and offers a ram in substitution. In the case of Jesus, God gives God's own self as the ram. God's being is entirely without violence, darkness, duplicity, ambivalence, or ambiguity. This message is unpacked further in 1 John 4, verses 8 through 10. For God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his only Son into the world that we might live through him. And this is love. Not that we loved God, but that God loved us and sent his Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. The author of Genesis 22 clearly views Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac as a response to divine command. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. In other words, the leader is led to experience Abraham's willingness to sacrifice even his only son, the heir to God's promise of countless descendants, as a faithful response to what one scholar calls a preconceived theological necessity. The evangelical anthropology of René Girard would have us severely question such a notion of theological necessity. It would have us ask, is that really the voice of the true God who commands the sacrifice of Isaac? Or any sacrifice for that matter? Isn't the trajectory of the Judeo-Christian scriptures to learn what this means? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In Matthew 9, verse 13, Jesus quoting Hosea 6, verse 6. Girard's anthropology helps to clarify and really reveal clearly that all sacrifice is of anthropological necessity rather than theological necessity, meaning it's a human compulsion rather than a divine one. So now we can more easily hear Genesis 22, 1 through 2 as a voice of those false gods of our own creation. False gods that kind of soak into us from our culture. It's a voice for which Abraham begins us on the long journey to unlearn, to hear by faith, so that we might hear the voice of the true God. Abraham bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham!" Do you hear in the repeated call of Abraham's name the dire urgency of this divine command? For God's sake, do not harm your son. To me, it's almost as if Sarah figured out what was going on and screamed prayers to heaven with tears of motherly love for her little boy streaming down her face. Heaven takes action instantly and screams at Abraham to stop. Stop the horrific and hypnotic, mindless act of stabbing to death his own son, of killing the only child of his wife, Sarah. This astounding moment of this Genesis 22 text is in its ending. when at the last second Abraham differentiates the voice of the true God, which halts the sacrifice of his son. Then, as Abraham had told Isaac, God provides. God provides a ram to take the place of the beloved son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Abraham's naming of the mountain of averted child sacrifice as the Lord will provide expresses his gratitude for the ram caught in the thicket that he sacrifices in place of his son, and it adds weight to this passage's statement against child sacrifice. A different and powerful perspective emerges when the Hebrew verb provide, yireh, in these verses is translated literally as see. On the mountain that Abraham calls, the Lord sees. God appears as a responsive witness to a child's vulnerability and distress. Abraham is known as the father of faith within 3 Abrahamic world religions. His willingness to sacrifice his son at God's command is one of the foundations of this reputation. One scholar points out that in an age threatened by religious extremism and violence in the name of God, however, Abraham's unquestioning obedience to God provides a dangerous model. Abraham had interceded and bargained with God to spare the wicked city of Sodom in Genesis 18. But where are Abraham's words of protest and intercession on behalf of his own son? Where is his exercise of moral agency? One author writes in her book, "Isn't 'Get thee behind me, Satan' the proper response?" One Girardian scholar points out that the unveiling of sacred violence means the unveiling of our false gods. He argues that the correct reading of this story is to see that Abraham passed the test of faith not by listening to the voice of the false gods of sacred violence at the story's opening, but by listening to the voice of Yahweh, the Lord, at the story's close. Others point out, while Abraham's case represents an extreme, it's not unique. In today's world, we are also called to discernment and accountability as the well-being of children continues to be sacrificed. Neglect, violence, sexual abuse, poor education, homelessness, racism, and hunger are among the many threats faced by children in our communities in the United States and across the globe. Child labor and prostitution, diseases including HIV, food insecurity, and natural disasters related to global warming are further examples. And the challenges to children today are so enormous that addressing them will take the commitment of all 3 Abrahamic faiths in cooperation with other people of goodwill. The precarious situation of children in today's world is a test for our faith, for our understanding of who God is and what God desires of us. The good news in Genesis 22 is that God desires the child to live as a blessing and a hope for the future. This text compels those who claim this as part of their sacred scripture to make daily decisions and political commitments in light of God's attentiveness to the child and in light of the divine command, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything of harm to him." One scholar concludes that Genesis 22 remains a provocative point of entry for grappling with the radical demands of faith. It provides a testimony that wherever violence against a child is halted, and whenever the needs and well-being of children receive attention, God is seen in that place. What false gods lurking in our own cultural milieu might we be listening to as we grapple with the plight of children around the world, from our own here in our zip code, attending failing schools, and those in the Tampa Bay area who are food insecure, as well as children who are refugees or fleeing violence in Central America or fleeing violence and civil wars in the Middle East, and who are now harmed in systemic ways by this global pandemic. How might we let this provocative story from Genesis shape us as a community. Let us pray. Most loving God, who sees the belovedness in every one of your children, continue to shape our vision and identity through your sacred word and presence. Lead us in the way of faithfulness. In particular, what is required of us during this time of great disruption and need. If we need our own assumptions and theology changed, have at it. Hear our prayers for the children in our world and community who are especially vulnerable. We ask for their well-being. Watch over all the students returning to schools, colleges, and university, even as the virus continues to wreak havoc. Help us practice the golden rule and to be prompted by our generosity to support the care, well-being, and future of your precious and beloved children. Thank you for your self-giving love and sacrifice in Christ our Lord, in whose name we live and humbly pray. Amen. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you again next week.